A homeless Navy SEAL's dog uncovered the one secret his father died protecting, and it exposed a betrayal worth millions. Everyone laughed when Caleb Mercer inherited nothing but a forgotten $400 mountain house. They thought his wealthy brother had won everything. But deep beneath those weathered floorboards, one loyal military K-9 uncovered a hidden truth that would save innocent lives, shatter a powerful family, and give one broken soldier a reason to live again. Comment 1 if you believe honor should always come before money, or 0 if you think family should be protected no matter what. And tell us where you're watching from. The morning Thomas Mercer was laid to rest, the sky above the foothills outside Red Lodge, Montana, looked as though someone had painted the entire horizon with cold steel. Thick clouds pressed low over the pine-covered ridges, swallowing the peaks that usually dominated the valley. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, spruce needles, and the promise of early snow. It was the kind of October morning that never seemed to grow brighter, no matter how many hours passed. More than 300 people filled the old white church overlooking the valley. Ranchers arrived before sunrise, removing weathered cowboy hats as they stepped through the heavy wooden doors. Contractors who had spent decades competing with Thomas Mercer stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Retired firefighters, school teachers, mechanics, veterans, and families whose homes Thomas had built all gathered beneath stained glass windows glowing faintly against the gray sky. Some remembered the barns he had raised that still stood straight after 30 winters. Others remembered how he rebuilt porches for widows who could not afford to pay him. Several remembered that he had never once walked away from a promise. No one spoke about money. Everyone spoke about trust. Caleb Mercer remained near the back of the sanctuary. His black suit had been borrowed from a veterans' shelter nearly 200 miles away. The sleeves were slightly too short, and the jacket no longer held its shape, but it was clean. That mattered to him. Beside him sat Titan. The retired military German shepherd rested quietly on the worn wooden floor, his ears alert but relaxed. A faded tactical collar still circled his thick neck, carrying small scratches earned during years of service beside Caleb overseas. Most people noticed the dog before they noticed the man. Caleb's beard had grown uneven over months spent sleeping in truck stops, abandoned campgrounds, and roadside parking lots. Thin white scars crossed his jaw and disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. His shoulders remained broad beneath the ill-fitting jacket, but they carried the invisible weight of someone who had survived battles that refused to stay in the past. He hadn't slept more than 2 consecutive hours in years. Every loud sound still searched for him. Every unexpected movement still made his muscles prepare for danger before his mind could catch up. Titan knew every one of those moments before Caleb did. When Caleb's breathing became too shallow, Titan quietly leaned against his leg. When his hands trembled, Titan rested his head across Caleb's knee. Today, the old dog remained perfectly still, sensing that this silence belonged to something neither bullets nor explosions had created. The pastor spoke softly about Thomas Mercer. He called him a man who believed that a house was more than lumber and nails. "It is easy," the pastor said, "to measure a building by its square footage. It is much harder to measure it by the lives it shelters." Several people quietly nodded. An elderly rancher in the front pew wiped his eyes. "He built my first barn," the man whispered to his grandson. "Still hasn't shifted an inch." Another woman smiled sadly. "When my husband died, Thomas fixed my roof before winter. Never sent a bill." The stories continued. Every memory sounded ordinary. Together they described an extraordinary man. Caleb listened without lifting his eyes. His father had never spoken much about kindness. He had simply practiced it. The military had taught Caleb that honor lived inside impossible decisions. His father had taught him that honor also lived inside ordinary Tuesdays. Fixing someone's fence, helping a stranger without being asked, building something that would outlive the man who built it. The pastor closed his Bible. Outside, the wind stirred through towering pines surrounding the cemetery. 6 veterans folded the American flag that had rested across Thomas Mercer's casket. Thomas had never served in combat. He had served as a military engineer decades earlier, designing structures that protected soldiers stationed overseas. Caleb remembered standing beside his father as a boy, while Thomas explained why foundations mattered more than paint. "People admire what they can see," Thomas had once said, "but they trust what they never notice." At the time, Caleb thought they were talking about houses. Years later, he realized they had been talking about people. The cemetery overlooked miles of golden pasture, broken only by winding fences and distant ranches. As the final prayers ended, mourners slowly approached Caleb. Some offered handshakes. Others simply rested a hand on his shoulder. No one mentioned the years he had disappeared after leaving the Navy. No one mentioned homelessness. No one mentioned PTSD. They simply treated him like Thomas Mercer's son. For the first time in years, Caleb felt seen without feeling judged. Only one person moved differently through the crowd. Grant Mercer. Tall, impeccably dressed. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly across his shoulders. Polished leather shoes remained spotless despite the muddy cemetery paths. He accepted condolences with effortless confidence. Every handshake lasted exactly long enough. Every expression seemed carefully measured. "I'm grateful you came," he repeated. "My father would have appreciated this." The words sounded appropriate, yet something inside them felt empty. Grant never spoke about Thomas teaching him anything. Never mentioned working beside him. Never laughed about childhood memories. Everything remained polished, professional, safe. Luke Mercer stayed several steps behind his older brother. Unlike Grant, Luke seemed uncomfortable accepting sympathy. He kept glancing toward Caleb as though wanting to speak, but never finding the courage. His wife quietly held his arm. Their young son chased fallen leaves near the cemetery fence until his mother gently called him back. Life kept moving, even here. After the burial, most people drove toward town. Only a handful remained among the graves. One of them was an elderly woman wearing a thick wool coat and carrying fresh wildflowers. She approached Caleb slowly. "My name is Helen Brooks," she said. Her voice carried the calm steadiness of someone who had weathered many difficult seasons. "I knew your father for a long time." Caleb nodded politely. "He talked about you every Saturday." That surprised him. "My father talked about me?" Helen smiled faintly. More than he realized. She looked toward the mountains stretching west. "If you ever find yourself near Beartooth Ridge," she hesitated, "come visit." Caleb frowned. "I don't know where that is." "You will." She gently squeezed his hand. "Your father made certain of that." Before Caleb could ask another question, she walked away. Titan watched her leave but remained calm. The dog rarely trusted strangers immediately. Something about Helen seemed familiar to him. Perhaps she carried his master's scent. Perhaps something deeper. By late afternoon, the family gathered inside Gerald Whitaker's law office on Main Street. The building smelled faintly of old paper, leather bindings, and fresh coffee. Rain tapped softly against tall windows overlooking the nearly empty street. Gerald adjusted his glasses before opening Thomas Mercer's will. The reading began with routine legal language: savings accounts, vehicles, equipment, business holdings. Then came the company, Mercer Construction, built over 34 years, known across southern Montana for uncompromising craftsmanship. "The company," Gerald read, "shall transfer to my eldest son, Grant Mercer." Grant gave one small nod. No surprise crossed his face. Luke received financial assets, investment accounts, personal savings, several parcels of farmland. Then Gerald turned another page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. There remains one final item. Everyone looked up. Thomas Mercer owned one additional property, Parcel 17B, located on Beartooth Ridge, purchased at a county tax auction 8 years ago. Purchase price, $400. Gerald paused. The property, together with every structure upon it, is left solely to my youngest son. He looked directly at Caleb. Caleb Mercer. Silence settled across the room. Grant blinked once. What property? A mountain parcel, Gerald answered. Unfinished residential structure. 3 acres. Remote access road. Grant leaned back in his chair. That's the one Dad wasted $400 on? Gerald nodded. Grant gave a quiet laugh. So that's his grand surprise. He looked across the table at Caleb. Congratulations. Another small laugh. You just inherited the most expensive mistake Dad ever made. Luke lowered his eyes. He didn't laugh. Neither did Gerald. Caleb accepted the folded deed without speaking. He had expected nothing. Receiving almost nothing somehow hurt more. As everyone prepared to leave, Grant buttoned his coat. You can keep it, he said casually. I doubt anyone else wants it. The office door closed behind him. Luke lingered. I'm sorry, he whispered. Caleb looked at him. For what? Luke searched for words that never came. Then he quietly followed Grant into the rain. The room became still. Gerald handed Caleb an old brass key attached to a weathered leather strap. Your father left this with the deed. No explanation? None. Caleb turned the key over in his hand. The metal felt worn smooth from years of use. Outside, rain had begun falling steadily. Caleb stepped into the parking lot beside his battered pickup truck. Titan jumped into the passenger seat before Caleb even opened his own door. The old German shepherd settled quietly. Then, without warning, Titan stood. Every muscle along his back tightened. His amber eyes locked onto Grant, who was climbing into a black luxury SUV across the lot. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stared. Long, unmoving, as though recognizing danger hidden beneath polished manners. Caleb noticed the stare, then looked toward his brother. Grant smiled politely before driving away into the rain. Caleb glanced back at Titan. What is it, buddy? Titan never looked away from the disappearing SUV, not until it vanished around the corner. Only then did the old war dog slowly sit back down. Caleb started the engine. He placed the brass key on the dashboard beside the folded deed. Outside, the mountains disappeared beneath gathering clouds. Somewhere beyond those ridges, a forgotten house waited, bought for $400, left behind by a father who had built a lifetime earning everyone's trust. Caleb believed he had inherited nothing. Titan seemed to believe otherwise. The windshield wipers pushed away another curtain of rain as Caleb steered the aging pickup west out of Red Lodge. The brass key rested on the dashboard beside the folded deed, sliding slightly whenever the truck rounded another curve. Titan lay in the passenger seat with his muzzle against the window, watching the mountains grow larger with every mile. Neither of them had anywhere else to go. The veterans' shelter where Caleb had been sleeping had a waiting list longer than winter itself. His truck had nearly 280,000 miles on the odometer, and the engine made a tired knocking sound whenever the road climbed uphill. His checking account held less than $300. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. Still, the road kept leading west. The paved highway narrowed into an older county road lined with sprawling cattle ranches. Rusted windmills turned slowly in the cold breeze. Horses stood quietly behind split-rail fences, their coats already growing thick for the coming winter. Golden fields stretched toward forests that climbed the lower slopes of the Beartooth Mountains. Thomas Mercer had loved this country. Caleb remembered sitting beside his father in an old pickup when he was 9 years old, watching snow settle across the pines, while Thomas explained why mountain cabins had steeper roofs than houses in town. "Snow teaches builders humility," his father had said with a grin. "Ignore nature, and she'll redesign your house herself." Caleb smiled faintly despite himself. It was the first genuine smile he had managed since the funeral. Titan noticed. The old German shepherd lifted his head, studied Caleb's face for a moment, then quietly settled again. The road continued climbing. By late afternoon, pavement disappeared beneath packed gravel. Towering lodgepole pines crowded closer to both sides of the narrow road until the forest seemed to swallow everything beyond the truck's headlights. Snowflakes began drifting through the air. Not enough to cover the ground, just enough to remind travelers who truly owned these mountains. Caleb checked the directions Gerald had written on the back of a business card. 3 miles. Turn left at an abandoned logging bridge. Continue until the road ends. Simple enough. Except the logging bridge looked ready to collapse into the creek below. The old wooden beams groaned as the pickup rolled across them. Water rushed beneath, clear and fast, carrying fallen leaves toward lower valleys. Titan stood before the truck had even reached the opposite side. His ears pointed forward. His nose tested the air through a cracked window. "What do you smell?" Caleb asked quietly. Titan offered no answer beyond silent attention. Another mile passed, then another. Finally, the gravel road ended at an old chain-link gate hanging crooked from one hinge. The rusted padlock had long since broken apart. Beyond the gate, waist-high grass covered what had once been a driveway. Caleb climbed out. Cold mountain air struck immediately, carrying the clean scent of pine sap and melting snow. Silence surrounded them. Not city silence, real silence. No traffic, no sirens, no voices. Only wind moving through evergreen branches high overhead. Titan jumped down beside him. Without hesitation, the dog walked through the open gate, as though he already knew where they belonged. Caleb followed. The old driveway curved gently uphill through thick stands of pine before opening into a small clearing. There it stood. The house. From a distance it looked abandoned. Gray plywood covered unfinished exterior walls. The front porch lacked railings. Plastic sheeting flapped over one window with every gust of wind. Weather had faded every exposed surface until the building seemed almost forgotten by time itself. Caleb stopped walking. This, he looked down at the deed, is worth $400, maybe less. He couldn't imagine why his father had ever bought it, or why he had left it behind. Titan continued toward the porch. His pace remained calm but purposeful. Caleb slowly followed. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. He glanced downward automatically. Years of military training had taught him to read surfaces before trusting them. The boards looked old, but they didn't flex. Interesting. He crouched, pressed one hand against the wood. Solid. Very solid. The joints fit tightly together despite years of exposure. Whoever built this porch knew exactly what they were doing. Caleb stood again. His father had built porches like this. Never quickly, always correctly. The heavy front door surprised him even more. It swung open without resistance. No squeak, no sticking. The hinges moved with perfect balance. Someone had maintained them, or had built them so well they hardly needed maintenance at all. Inside. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. Nothing matched the outside. Massive timber beams crossed the ceiling in perfect symmetry. White oak floors stretched across the main room beneath a thin layer of dust that somehow failed to hide their craftsmanship. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating hand-cut joinery so precise that Caleb struggled to find gaps between adjoining beams. The room smelled of cedar, dry wood, stone, not mildew, not decay. Home. He walked farther inside. Every instinct expected unfinished construction. Instead, he found beauty hidden beneath neglect. The stone fireplace dominated one wall. Each rock appeared individually chosen. Built-in bookshelves lined another. Their edges remained perfectly square. The staircase rose gracefully toward a second floor. No nails showed where modern builders would have used dozens. Everything fit together through craftsmanship instead of shortcuts. Caleb reached out and touched one of the support posts. His fingertips followed smooth grain polished by careful hands. His father's hands. "I'm standing inside something you built." The realization settled slowly. Not just any structure. Something personal. Something secret. Titan wandered quietly through the room. The old dog sniffed furniture, walls, corners, windows, then stopped. His head turned toward the staircase. He walked beneath it, sniffed once, twice, then began slowly circling the same section of wall. Caleb barely noticed. He remained absorbed by the house itself. The kitchen occupied the rear of the main floor. Handmade cabinets stretched beneath wide windows overlooking the forest. The countertops consisted of thick maple slabs instead of manufactured materials. Even after years without occupants, everything remained straight. Level. True. Thomas Mercer had once said that careless builders always believed nobody would notice what hid behind drywall. Good builders understood they always would. Eventually. Caleb climbed the staircase. Not one step creaked beneath his weight. The upstairs contained 2 bedrooms. One overlooked the mountains. The other contained a sturdy wooden desk positioned beside a window facing east. Nothing else. No decorations. No photographs. No clothing. Just the desk. Almost as though someone had expected another person to someday sit there. He opened empty drawers. Nothing. The closets stood vacant. Whoever had built the house had never truly lived inside it. Why? The question stayed with him as he descended again. Outside, daylight had begun fading behind snow-filled clouds. He carried 2 duffel bags from the truck. One held clothing. The other contained nearly everything else he owned. A sleeping bag, flashlight, first aid kit, military canteen, 2 paperbacks, Titan's food bowl. His own future fit inside 2 bags. He spread the sleeping bag beside the fireplace. The old routine returned automatically. Secure the entrances. Check every room. Locate exits. Confirm sight lines through every window. War had taught habits difficult to abandon, even in peace. Especially in peace. As darkness settled over the clearing, wind whispered through towering pines surrounding the property. Caleb built a small fire using dry wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Whoever had placed it there had cut every log to nearly identical length, another detail his father would have appreciated. Flames climbed slowly. Warm orange light danced across timber beams overhead. For the first time in months, Caleb wasn't sleeping inside a truck, or beneath a highway overpass, or on a shelter cot. Titan curled beside the fire. His breathing slowed. Caleb leaned back against one of the support posts. The warmth felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. Safe places often disappeared. Combat had taught him that too. He closed his eyes, only for a moment. The explosion arrived anyway. Dust, smoke, someone screaming for a medic. the unmistakable crack of rifle fire echoing through a narrow Afghan valley. Caleb jerked upright. His breathing came fast. His hands searched automatically for the rifle that no longer existed. Titan was already there. The German shepherd pressed his body firmly against Caleb's chest. One paw rested gently across Caleb's knee. Steady pressure. Calm breathing. The same trained response practiced hundreds of times after Caleb returned home. Slowly, the mountains replaced Afghanistan. The fireplace replaced burning vehicles. The pine-scented air replaced smoke. "I'm okay," Caleb whispered. Titan remained exactly where he was until Caleb's breathing steadied. Only then did the dog return to the fire. Outside, snow began falling more heavily. Inside, the old house barely seemed to notice. The beams never groaned. The walls never shifted. The structure stood quietly against the storm. Hours later, after the fire had settled into glowing coals, Titan rose once more. Without making a sound, he walked beneath the staircase. He lowered his nose toward one particular section of timber, sniffed carefully, then scratched once, paused, scratched again. Not excited, not playful, intentional. Caleb watched from across the room. "What is it?" Titan glanced back, then returned to sniffing the exact same place. Caleb crossed the room carrying his flashlight. The beam illuminated an ordinary-looking timber post supporting the staircase. Nothing appeared unusual. He knocked lightly against it. Solid. Or so it seemed. He shrugged. "Tomorrow." Titan looked unconvinced. The old dog settled beside the staircase instead of the fireplace, watching, waiting, as though guarding a secret that had waited years for someone to notice. Outside, snow quietly covered the mountain clearing. Inside, Caleb Mercer slept beneath a roof his father had built in silence. For the first time in years, he dreamed of home instead of war. And beneath the staircase, Titan never stopped listening. The old German shepherd remained perfectly still, his nose inches from the timber support as moonlight filtered through the frosted windows. Outside, fresh snow settled quietly across the clearing, softening every sound the mountains made. Inside, only the steady crackle of dying embers disturbed the silence. Caleb slept for less than an hour. The nightmare arrived without warning. He was back in eastern Afghanistan. The mountain air became dust. The smell of cedar vanished beneath smoke and burning fuel. A convoy crawled through a narrow valley lined with broken stone walls. Caleb recognized every turn before it happened. He remembered the silence that always came just before an ambush. Then came the explosion. The ground lifted beneath him. Metal screamed. Someone shouted his name. Another voice cried for help. He tried to run toward it, but his boots would not move. The valley disappeared beneath smoke. Then another blast. Caleb jerked awake with a gasp, throwing his arm toward an enemy that no longer existed. Titan was already there. The old dog pressed firmly against Caleb's chest, leaning his full weight forward exactly as he had been trained years before. His breathing remained slow and steady. His warm body blocked Caleb's frantic movements without force, patiently anchoring him back to the room. Caleb stared into the darkness. The timber beams slowly came into focus. The stone fireplace, the unfinished walls, the snow tapping softly against the windows. Montana. Not Afghanistan. He closed his eyes again. "I'm home," he whispered. The words sounded unfamiliar. Titan remained beside him another full minute before quietly returning to his place beneath the staircase. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Golden sunlight slipped through the eastern windows, filling the house with warmth that seemed impossible after such a cold night. Caleb stood outside holding a cup of instant coffee, watching thin ribbons of fog drift between towering pine trees. The mountains rose beyond them in silent layers of blue and white, stretching farther than he could see. He had forgotten how quiet real wilderness could be. Not empty. Alive. A raven crossed the valley overhead. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an elk bugled once before the sound disappeared into the trees. Titan explored the clearing carefully, checking every edge of the property before returning to Caleb's side. The old dog's routine had not changed since leaving the military. Secure the area, identify threats, return to the handler. Always return. Caleb smiled faintly. Still working, huh? Titan wagged his tail once. Around mid-morning, the distant rumble of an engine echoed through the valley. Caleb instinctively stiffened. Years of combat had conditioned him to identify vehicles long before seeing them. Pickup truck, older engine, moving slowly, not in a hurry. The truck finally appeared beyond the trees, climbing the narrow road toward the property. It stopped beside the gate. An elderly woman climbed out carrying a woven basket beneath one arm. She wore heavy boots, blue jeans, and a thick brown coat that had clearly seen many Montana winters. Titan watched her closely. He neither barked nor advanced. He simply observed. The woman smiled when she reached the porch. "I figured you might not have much to eat." Caleb recognized her immediately. "Helen." She nodded. "And you remembered." She held up the basket. "Fresh bread, chicken soup, coffee." Caleb hesitated. "You didn't have to." "I know." She smiled gently. "But your father would have." Something inside Caleb softened. He stepped aside. Helen entered the house slowly. She paused almost immediately. Her weathered fingers brushed one of the timber beams. He finished it. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He actually finished it. Caleb looked at her. "You knew about this place?" Helen nodded. "For 8 years. You've been here before?" "Not inside." She smiled toward the fireplace. "Thomas never invited anyone." She looked around the room with quiet admiration. "He wanted the first person through this door to be you." Caleb frowned. "But he never even told me it existed." Helen carried the basket into the kitchen. "Because he was waiting." "Waiting for what?" She turned slowly. "For the day you needed it." They sat together at the handmade kitchen table while steam rose from 2 mugs of coffee. Titan lay quietly nearby, though every few minutes he lifted his head toward the staircase. Helen noticed. "He's watching something. He keeps doing that." She looked thoughtfully toward the staircase. "Thomas used to look there sometimes." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" As though he was making sure something remained safe. Before Caleb could ask another question, Helen reached into her coat pocket. "I almost forgot." She placed a small leather-bound notebook onto the table. "I found this years ago after Thomas dropped it near my fence." Caleb carefully picked it up. The leather had worn smooth from years of handling. Inside the cover, written in careful handwriting, appeared 2 words. Caleb. No last name. No explanation. Just Caleb. His chest tightened. He opened the first page. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to his father. "If you're reading this, son, then life probably didn't unfold the way either of us hoped. I wish I could have handed this to you myself. Some things simply don't wait for our permission." Caleb swallowed hard. The next pages described ordinary Saturdays. Thomas clearing brush, pouring concrete, cutting timber, setting beams. Every entry explained not only what he built, but why. A proper foundation isn't hidden because it lacks importance. It's hidden because everything else depends on it. Caleb could almost hear his father's voice speaking each sentence. The notebook continued. Today, I shaped the first support beam. I thought about Caleb the entire time. He was always patient enough to learn, not because he enjoyed waiting, because he wanted to understand. Grant measures success in dollars. Luke measures comfort. Caleb measures responsibility. Every man builds according to what he measures. Caleb stopped reading. Helen quietly watched him. He talked about you often. He did? Every Saturday. She smiled toward the mountains outside. He'd work all day. Then around sunset, he'd stop by my fence for coffee. What did he say? Helen thought for a long moment. He worried. Worried about what? You. Caleb looked down. He knew the military had changed you. I tried not to let him see. He saw anyway. Silence settled between them. Finally, Helen spoke again. Thomas once told me something I've never forgotten. She looked directly at Caleb. He said soldiers usually come home carrying 2 backpacks. Caleb listened quietly. One holds everything they packed before leaving. The other holds everything they wish they'd never seen. She paused. He said he couldn't unpack that second backpack for you, but maybe. She looked around the house. He could build you somewhere safe enough to finally set it down. Caleb stared through the kitchen window toward endless forests beyond the clearing. Nobody had ever explained PTSD that simply, or that kindly. His father had understood, long before Caleb admitted it himself. Titan suddenly stood. Without warning, he walked back beneath the staircase. He sniffed carefully, then scratched twice, slowly, deliberately, again. Helen watched him. He's trying to tell you something. Caleb sighed. Maybe. He grabbed a flashlight and knelt beside the staircase. The timber post looked perfectly ordinary. He examined every visible joint, every board, every nail. Nothing. He tapped the wood with his knuckles. A dull sound echoed back. Solid enough. Titan scratched once more. Caleb smiled. Not today, partner. The dog didn't move. Instead, he lay directly beside the beam, placing one paw against the timber as though guarding it. Helen quietly noticed. So did Thomas. What? He always rested his hand there before leaving. Caleb looked up sharply. Every Saturday? She nodded. Every single Saturday. The room suddenly felt different, not frightening, purposeful. Caleb stood slowly. He looked around the house again. Not as an abandoned property, not as an inheritance, but as something intentionally created. Every beam, every stone, every board. His father hadn't simply built a shelter. He had left behind a message. Caleb just hadn't learned how to read it yet. That evening, after Helen drove back across the valley, snow began falling again. Caleb built another fire. Titan refused to leave his place beneath the staircase. Caleb opened the notebook once more. Near the end of the journal, he found another short sentence. One day, he'll know where to look. No explanation followed. Only those 7 words. Caleb read them twice, then looked slowly toward Titan. The old German shepherd raised his head. Their eyes met across the firelit room, for the first time. Caleb wondered if his father had trusted someone besides himself to protect the truth. Someone who had never forgotten an order. Someone who never abandoned his partner. Someone now lying patiently beneath the staircase, still waiting for Caleb to understand. Titan rested one paw against the timber beam, as though guarding something invisible. The fire burned low, filling the room with a soft amber glow that danced across the massive hand-cut beams overhead. Caleb watched his partner for a long time before finally closing the leather journal and placing it carefully on the kitchen table. "Whatever Dad wanted me to find," he said quietly, "it can wait until morning." Titan looked at him, then back at the staircase. The old dog did not argue. He simply remained where he was. Outside, another layer of snow settled over the mountains. By dawn, the clearing had become a world of white. The pine branches bowed beneath fresh powder, and sunlight reflected across the valley so brightly Caleb had to shield his eyes when he stepped onto the porch. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. The silence reminded him of early patrol mornings before sunrise, when entire valleys seemed to hold their breath. Those memories usually ended badly. Today, he refused to let them. He picked up an old shovel leaning against the porch and began clearing the front walkway. The physical work steadied his breathing. Every scoop of snow demanded attention. Every movement pushed anxious thoughts farther away. Titan trotted beside him, happily breaking a narrow path through the untouched snow. By late morning, another vehicle climbed the mountain road. This time it wasn't Helen. A black SUV rolled into the clearing, expensive tires crunching over the frozen gravel. Caleb recognized it immediately. Grant. Titan's posture changed before the engine stopped. The German Shepherd quietly moved between Caleb and the arriving vehicle. Not aggressive, protective. Grant climbed out wearing an expensive wool coat and polished boots that looked completely out of place in the mountain snow. He glanced around the property with open disbelief. "So this is it." His voice carried the same polished confidence Caleb remembered from the funeral. "Dad actually spent 8 years driving out here." Caleb rested both hands on the shovel. "What do you want?" Grant smiled politely. "I figured I'd check on you." "You drove 40 miles to check on me?" "I drove 40 miles because there are paperwork issues." Caleb said nothing. Grant opened a leather briefcase. "There are documents requiring signatures." He removed several folders. "Our attorneys completed the transition of Mercer Construction yesterday." Caleb accepted the papers without enthusiasm. Most of the language meant little to him. Corporate restructuring, asset distribution, ownership transfers. Grant pointed toward one section. "You'll need to sign here acknowledging you have no operational role in the company." Caleb looked up. "I never had one." "Exactly." Grant smiled. "This simply makes everything official." Caleb read more carefully. His father had left each of the 3 brothers equal ownership in the company. Equal. Grant had somehow changed that. When did this happen? "Our attorneys reviewed Dad's records." Grant spoke with practiced calm. "You were never an employee. I served overseas. I know. You also spent the last year taking care of Dad." "I know, but legally," Grant tapped the document, "neither of those things makes you part of the business." Caleb stared at him. "I gave up everything to come home. You made that decision. Dad needed me." Grant shrugged almost imperceptibly. The company needed leadership. Silence settled over the clearing. Snow drifted gently between them. Titan never took his eyes off Grant. Caleb looked back at the paperwork. "What happens if I don't sign?" Grant folded his arms. "Our attorneys proceed anyway. So this isn't really a choice, it never was." The words landed harder than either man expected. Caleb signed, not because he agreed, because he no longer had the money to fight. Grant slipped the papers back into his briefcase. "One more thing." He hesitated. "The old house in town closes next week." Caleb's head lifted. "What?" "The buyers are already moving forward." "Our family home? It belongs to the estate." Dad built that house. Grant nodded. And now someone else will live there. Caleb felt something tighten deep inside his chest. Every birthday, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee, every memory of his mother before cancer took her. Gone. Just like that. Grant glanced toward the mountain house. I still don't understand why Dad wanted this place. Caleb didn't answer. Grant laughed softly. Maybe he figured it was all you could handle. Titan released a low growl. Quiet, controlled, enough to stop the conversation. Grant looked at the dog. He always did hate me. No, Caleb replied calmly. He just reads people well. For the first time, Grant's smile disappeared. He climbed back into the SUV without another word. The vehicle disappeared down the snowy road. Only after the engine faded into the distance did Titan relax. Caleb remained standing in the clearing. The silence returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. That afternoon, he drove into Red Lodge. He parked across the street from the family home. Moving trucks filled the driveway. A young couple carried boxes through the front door while laughing about where to place nursery furniture. The maple tree Caleb had climbed as a boy still stood in the backyard. The porch swing his father built remained hanging beneath the front overhang. Everything looked exactly the same, except none of it belonged to the Mercers anymore. Caleb stayed inside the truck. He couldn't bring himself to walk closer. Titan rested his head against Caleb's shoulder. Together, they watched strangers begin new lives inside the house Thomas Mercer had built board by board. Caleb finally started the engine. He drove away without saying goodbye. The next stop proved even harder. Mercer Construction. The familiar building stood freshly painted. The old wooden company sign had disappeared. A sleek metal logo bearing Grant's name now hung above the entrance. Through the front windows, Caleb saw new furniture, new computers, new faces. Nothing remained of the workshop where Thomas had taught him to identify straight grain by touch alone. Caleb parked across the street. He remembered being 10 years old, sweeping sawdust while his father patiently explained the difference between doing a job quickly and doing it correctly. Fast work earns money, Thomas had said. Good work earns trust. Back then, Caleb thought both happened together. Now he wasn't so sure. His phone vibrated. Luke. Caleb answered after the second ring. I heard Grant came out there. He did. I'm sorry. Caleb waited. Luke continued. I argued with him. Did you? For what it was worth. Caleb looked through the windshield. It wasn't worth much. Luke sighed. I have Emily and the kids. I know. If I lose my job, I know. Silence filled the line. I don't think Dad would have wanted this, Luke whispered. No. He wouldn't. Another long pause. I wish I knew how to fix it. Caleb looked toward the mountains rising beyond town. So do I. The call ended quietly. By sunset, Caleb returned to the mountain house. The isolation that had felt comforting yesterday now felt enormous. The world he'd known had disappeared in less than 2 weeks. His father was gone. His childhood home belonged to strangers. The family business had been taken from him. His brothers stood on opposite sides of a line neither seemed able to cross. He carried the last grocery bag inside. 2 cans of soup, bread, coffee. Titan followed close behind. The old dog sensed every change in Caleb's breathing. Inside the house, Caleb sat beside the fireplace without lighting it. Darkness slowly filled the room. His thoughts drifted toward places he tried never to visit. Maybe Grant was right. Maybe this house really was all that remained. Maybe there wasn't anything worth finding beneath the staircase. Maybe his father had simply made one mistake. He stood, walked toward the front door, picked up his duffel bag. "I'm leaving." The words echoed through the empty house. Titan didn't move. He remained beside the staircase, watching, waiting. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Cold wind rushed across the clearing. He threw the duffel into the truck bed, then reached for the driver's door. Behind him, a single sound. Scratch. 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 Not loud. Not desperate. Patient. Caleb closed his eyes. He knew that rhythm. Titan wasn't asking. He was insisting. Caleb turned. The old German shepherd still sat beneath the staircase exactly where he had been since the first night. One paw rested gently against the same timber beam, the same place, every single time. Caleb looked from the dog to the beam, then toward the leather journal resting on the kitchen table. His father's final words echoed through his memory. "One day, he'll know where to look." The mountain wind howled outside. Caleb slowly picked up his duffel from the truck bed. Without another word, he carried it back inside. For the second time in his life, a faithful military dog had stopped him from walking away. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't overseas. It was home. Caleb stood in the middle of the quiet room, his duffel bag hanging from one hand, while Titan remained beneath the staircase with calm, unwavering patience. The old German shepherd had not barked. He had not whined. He had simply refused to leave. Caleb slowly set the bag back on the floor. "You win." Titan's ears lifted. His tail brushed the hardwood once. That single movement carried more relief than excitement. Outside, another light snowfall drifted through the towering pines. Morning sunlight reflected across the white landscape, turning every branch into polished silver. For the first time since returning to Montana, Caleb made a decision that wasn't about surviving another day. He decided to stay. Not forever. Just one more week. 1 week to understand why his father had built this place. 1 week before deciding whether it was worth saving. The next morning began before sunrise. Years in the Navy had trained Caleb to wake before daylight without needing an alarm. He stepped onto the porch carrying a mug of black coffee while Titan completed his usual patrol around the clearing. The cold air stung Caleb's lungs. It also cleared his mind. The porch looked worse in daylight. One railing had never been installed. Tall weeds pushed through broken stone edging. Dead branches littered the yard. The roof remained sound, but gutters sagged beneath years of neglect. It wasn't abandoned. It had simply been waiting. Caleb found an old push broom leaning inside the workshop closet. Without thinking, he started sweeping. Dry pine needles, dust, leaves carried in by years of mountain wind. Each stroke revealed more of the beautiful white oak floor beneath. The simple rhythm steadied him. Sweep, pause, breathe, repeat. Titan followed every movement, occasionally carrying sticks outside as though participating in the cleanup himself. By noon, sunlight poured through cleaner windows. The house felt brighter, almost alive. Just after lunch, another pickup appeared on the mountain road. Helen Brooks climbed out carrying work gloves instead of food. "I figured soup wasn't what this place needed today." Caleb smiled. "What did you have in mind?" She held up a pair of pruning shears. "Weeds." An hour later, they worked side by side along the overgrown driveway. Helen cut back thick brush while Caleb hauled fallen branches into neat piles. Titan darted between them, happily dragging smaller limbs toward the growing stack, as though determined to prove he was part of the crew. Helen laughed. "I've never seen a dog volunteer for yard work. He never liked being left out. He reminds me of someone." "My dad?" She nodded. Thomas couldn't sit still either. The afternoon passed beneath clear blue skies. As they worked, Helen pointed toward distant ranches scattered across the valley. The Wilson family owns that place. She gestured toward a weathered red barn. Storm damaged their fence last week. A little farther west stood another property. The Parkers need repairs on an old footbridge. She smiled at Caleb. Folks around here always need someone who knows how to work. Caleb shook his head. I'm not a carpenter. No. Helen looked at him thoughtfully. You're a man who spent years solving difficult problems under pressure. That's different. Is it? She picked up another bundle of branches. Thomas used to say building is mostly solving one small problem after another. Caleb considered that. Maybe construction wasn't so different from military planning after all. Both demanded patience, preparation, discipline. By evening, the front yard already looked transformed. The hidden gravel path emerged beneath years of weeds. Stone borders reappeared. The porch no longer looked forgotten. Inside, Caleb found another notebook lying beneath the leather journal on the kitchen table. He hadn't noticed it before. Its cover read simply, Property Maintenance. Inside, Thomas had written careful lists. Inspect roof every fall, oil front door hinges before winter, clean chimney each October, check drainage around foundation after heavy snowmelt. Nothing extraordinary. Just quiet responsibility. The last page held one sentence underlined twice. Take care of this place, and it will take care of you. Caleb closed the notebook slowly. The next morning, Helen returned with an older rancher named Roy Wilson. Roy studied Caleb for several long seconds before extending one rough, weathered hand. Heard you're Thomas's boy. I am. He fixed my hay barn 26 years ago. Roy looked toward the house. He built this too? I think so. Roy whistled quietly. He never mentioned it. No, he didn't. Roy shifted his weight. My west fence came down in last week's storm. Caleb immediately shook his head. I appreciate it, but I'm not looking for charity. Roy frowned. I didn't offer charity. Caleb blinked. I offered work. Silence settled between them. I've never built a fence. Roy grinned. You ever follow instructions? Caleb almost laughed. A few. Then you'll do fine. They spent the afternoon replacing weather-beaten fence posts across snow-covered pasture. Roy explained everything patiently. How to brace corners, how tightly to stretch wire, why every post mattered. Caleb listened carefully. Military habits returned. Observe. Learn. Repeat. Titan trotted the fence line, while Roy's border collie watched with obvious curiosity. At one point, 3 calves slipped through an unfinished section. Before anyone reacted, Titan sprinted across the pasture. Without barking or frightening them, he calmly guided every calf back through the opening, using the same disciplined movements once used to control frightened civilians during overseas evacuations. Roy lowered his hammer. I'll be. The rancher looked at Caleb. That dog's smarter than half the people I know. Caleb smiled proudly. He usually is. By sunset, the fence stood straighter than before. Roy counted several folded bills into Caleb's hand. Caleb stared at them. I didn't expect. You earned it. Roy climbed into his truck. And if you're looking for more work, he pointed toward neighboring ranches. Word travels fast around here. The truck disappeared down the road. Caleb looked at the money. Not much, but honestly earned. It had been a long time since he felt that kind of satisfaction. Over the next several weeks, the mountain slowly accepted him. One day he repaired loose barn siding. Another day he replaced broken porch steps for an elderly couple living farther down the valley. He mended gates, straightened warped doors, cleared fallen trees after heavy winds. Thomas's notebooks became his evening classroom. Each repair taught another lesson. Each lesson built another layer of confidence. Titan became just as well known. Children laughed whenever the retired military dog visited town. He gently carried dropped gloves back to elderly neighbors. He found a missing lamb buried beneath fresh snow after a blizzard. He quietly stood beside Caleb whenever crowded places became overwhelming. The townspeople stopped seeing a homeless veteran. They began seeing a dependable man. One afternoon, Caleb found himself laughing with several ranchers over coffee inside a small diner near Red Lodge. Halfway through the conversation, he suddenly realized something. No one had asked about Afghanistan. No one had pitied him. No one treated him like he was broken. They simply accepted him, exactly as he was. That realization stayed with him all the way back to the mountain. The house slowly changed too. The front porch stood clean. Broken shutters came down. Dead brush disappeared. Fresh-cut firewood filled neat stacks beside the stone fireplace. Life returned one small task at a time. Yet one thing never changed. Every evening, without fail, Titan walked beneath the staircase. He sniffed the same timber beam, placed one paw against it, then quietly lay down, waiting, watching. One rainy evening, Caleb finally knelt beside him. "You really aren't giving this up, are you?" Titan looked into Caleb's eyes, then gently touched the beam once more with his nose. Caleb rested his hand against the old timber. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then he noticed something he had somehow missed every previous time. The grain pattern on one narrow section ran opposite every surrounding board, almost invisible, but different. His pulse quickened. He leaned closer. The seam was impossibly thin. Whoever built it had wanted no one to notice, except perhaps one person. Caleb slowly stood. "I think." He looked toward Titan. "You're finally getting through to me." The old German shepherd rose immediately. His ears stood tall. His tail remained perfectly still. Not excited. Certain. Outside, dark storm clouds rolled across the Beartooth Mountains. Thunder echoed faintly through the valley. Inside the house, for the first time, Caleb reached for his father's toolbox. Whatever waited behind that hidden beam. His father had spent 8 years making sure it remained undiscovered. Titan had spent weeks making sure it wouldn't stay that way. Rain hammered the roof with growing intensity. Wind swept through the towering pines surrounding the house, bending their dark branches until they groaned against the storm. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the ridge, briefly illuminating the valley in sharp white light before everything disappeared into darkness again. Caleb carried his father's old toolbox to the staircase. The wooden handle had been polished smooth by decades of work. Inside, every tool rested exactly where Thomas had left it. Nothing was rusted. Nothing had been tossed carelessly into place. Every chisel, every screwdriver, every small hammer, organized, ready, just as Thomas had always believed a craftsman should leave them. Titan stood beside the staircase without making a sound. His eyes never left the narrow section of timber hidden beneath the stairs. Caleb knelt. He ran his fingertips across the grain once more. Now that he knew where to look, the difference became impossible to ignore. One board had been cut from a different tree. Its grain curved slightly against the surrounding pattern, invisible to almost everyone, not invisible to Thomas, and certainly not to Titan. Caleb selected the thinnest putty knife from the toolbox. Carefully, he slid the blade into the nearly invisible seam. Nothing moved. He tried again from another angle. Still nothing. The craftsmanship amazed him. No nails, No exposed hinges. No visible latch. His father had built the panel so perfectly that it appeared to be part of the staircase itself. Thunder rolled overhead. Titan suddenly stepped forward. He pressed his nose against the lower corner of the timber, then gently nudged upward. Caleb stopped. He studied the corner more closely. A tiny gap, barely wider than a fingernail. He inserted the blade there instead. A quiet click echoed inside the wall. Caleb froze. Slowly, very slowly, the timber shifted outward. Not much, just enough. He grasped the edge carefully. The entire section swung open like a concealed door. Cold air drifted from the darkness beyond. Neither man nor dog moved. Caleb raised his flashlight. The beam disappeared into a narrow passage hidden inside the wall. Concrete steps descended beneath the house. Not a crawl space. A real staircase, built intentionally. Titan looked toward Caleb, waiting for permission. The old habit remained. Always wait for the handler. Caleb nodded. Let's go. Titan entered first. His movements were slow and deliberate. Every few steps he paused, listening. The staircase ended inside a surprisingly large underground workshop. Caleb stopped breathing. The flashlight swept slowly across the room. Workbenches stretched along one wall. Shelves filled another. Rows of hand tools hung with military precision. Everything remained perfectly organized. Dust covered the floor, but not much else. The room had been sealed tightly, protected, preserved. Caleb walked farther inside. The scent hit him immediately. Cedar, machine oil, leather, exactly the way his father's workshop had smelled when Caleb was a child. Titan quietly explored the room. His tail wagged once, almost proudly. Along the far wall stood 3 olive-green military footlockers. Each carried faded white stenciling. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Thomas Mercer. Caleb's pulse quickened. His father had kept them all these years. Beside the footlockers stood a massive woodworking bench. The surface bore countless tiny cuts and dents accumulated over decades of honest work. A heavy wooden vise remained clamped to one corner. Above it hung hand planes, chisels, squares, measuring gauges. Each tool rested inside its own carefully measured outline. Nothing had been placed randomly. Everything belonged exactly where Thomas intended. Caleb reached toward one old hand plane. The wooden handle felt warm despite the cold room. Beneath it, someone had carved 2 initials. T.M., his father. Nearby hung another older plane. Its handle carried different initials. J.M. Caleb frowned. His grandfather. James Mercer. A man Caleb had never met. 3 generations, all inside one hidden room. Titan walked toward another shelf. He stopped before several thick leather journals stacked neatly together. He looked back, almost as if inviting Caleb closer. Caleb carefully lifted the first journal. Its cover carried no title, only a date. 8 years earlier. Inside, the familiar handwriting appeared immediately. Today I bought the mountain property. Nobody else bid. $400. The county believes they sold worthless land. I believe I found the safest place my son may someday need. Caleb slowly sat down on the old workshop stool. His flashlight rested beside him. He kept reading. The next pages described clearing trees, surveying the land, pouring foundations, every step documented carefully. Thomas wrote not only what he built, he explained why. The location is isolated enough for peace, close enough to town for work, strong water source, good southern exposure for winter light. One day Caleb may need all these things. His hand trembled slightly as he turned another page. A photograph slipped free. Young Caleb, perhaps 10 years old, holding a fishing pole beside his father, both laughing, neither looking at the camera. Caleb stared for a long time. He had forgotten that day entirely. Titan quietly rested beside him. The dog placed one paw across Caleb's boot, the familiar grounding gesture. Caleb smiled through damp eyes. "Thanks, partner." Further inside the room, another shelf held rolled blueprints secured with leather straps, detailed architectural drawings, floor plans, foundation diagrams, every measurement written in Thomas's careful hand. The hidden workshop itself appeared among them. So did the concealed staircase. Everything had been planned from the beginning. Nothing here existed by accident. Then Caleb noticed one object sitting alone in the center of the workbench. A sealed envelope. His name appeared across the front. Caleb Mercer. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to his father. He reached toward it, then stopped. Not yet. Something told him the letter would change everything. He wasn't ready. Instead, he continued exploring. Several framed military photographs rested along the back shelf. Thomas wearing engineer insignia decades earlier. Construction crews rebuilding damaged bridges. Temporary field hospitals. Remote mountain outposts. Caleb had known his father served. He had never realized how much. Another shelf held engineering textbooks filled with handwritten notes. Bridge design. Concrete load calculations. Structural failure analysis. These weren't hobbies. This had been Thomas's life's work. Titan suddenly barked once. Short, sharp. Caleb turned. The dog stood beside one final cabinet built into the stone wall. Unlike everything else, this cabinet carried a brass lock, the same size, the same shape, as the brass key resting in Caleb's pocket. Slowly, he reached inside his jacket, pulled out the worn leather strap Gerald had handed him after the funeral. The old key caught the flashlight's beam. Caleb looked from the key to the locked cabinet, then toward the sealed envelope still resting on the workbench. Outside, thunder shook the mountains again. Inside the hidden workshop, generations of Mercer craftsmanship surrounded him. His father had built this place for one purpose. Everything inside waited for the same moment. The moment Caleb was finally ready to discover not merely what Thomas had hidden, but why. Titan sat quietly beside the locked cabinet, patient, certain. The old war dog had completed the mission only he seemed to understand. Now it was Caleb's turn. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. Caleb stood in the hidden workshop while rain drummed steadily against the world above. The flashlight rested on the workbench, casting long shadows across rows of hand tools polished by decades of careful use. Titan remained beside the locked cabinet without moving, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb with the quiet patience that had carried them through countless missions. Caleb slid the key into the brass lock. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then came a soft, metallic click. He opened the cabinet slowly. Inside were 5 thick binders, each labeled in his father's neat handwriting. Project records, material invoices, engineering reports, inspection notes, personal letters. Resting on top of everything lay the sealed envelope addressed to him. This time Caleb picked it up. He carefully broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. His father's familiar handwriting filled the page. Caleb. If you are reading this, then Titan has done exactly what I hoped he would. Caleb stopped. His eyes moved to the old German shepherd. Titan tilted his head slightly, as though recognizing his own name. Caleb continued reading. You probably think I built this place to give you shelter. I did. But that was never the whole reason. Some burdens cannot be carried into a courtroom without destroying people you still love. Some truths must wait until the right person is strong enough to carry them. You have always been that person. Caleb lowered the letter. His breathing had become slow and deliberate. Thomas had known, not only about the house, about Titan, about everything. He unfolded the remaining pages. The letter continued. Years ago, after Grant took over purchasing for Mercer Construction, I noticed changes. Small ones at first. Cheaper suppliers, different concrete deliveries, steel arriving without the certifications I requested. Every time I questioned it, I received the same answer. It saves money. Caleb frowned. His father had never spoken critically about Grant. Not once. Another page. I wanted to believe he simply lacked experience. Instead, I discovered something much worse. Caleb reached for the first binder. Its spine read, "Commercial Projects." Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Fresh concrete pours, steel reinforcement, foundation trenches. Each image carried handwritten notes, dates, measurements, material specifications, actual deliveries, everything documented with astonishing precision. Thomas had photographed every major stage of construction. Caleb turned another page. A side-by-side comparison. Contract specification. Actual material delivered. Concrete strength. Specified 5,000 pounds per square inch. Delivered 3,500 pounds per square inch. Steel reinforcement. Specified grade 60. Delivered lower grade. Inspector signature. Circled in red pencil. Beneath it, Thomas had written, "Approved without testing." Caleb felt a knot form in his stomach. One project could have been a mistake. Two, maybe negligence. But binder after binder revealed the same pattern. Warehouse, shopping center, medical office, apartment complex. Every project contained substitutions. Every substitution reduced costs. Every substitution weakened the structure. Every substitution increased company profits. Titan quietly lay beside Caleb's chair. The old dog watched without disturbing him. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. Caleb opened the second binder. This one contained copies of invoices, supplier records, purchase orders, every document carefully cross-referenced. Thomas hadn't relied on suspicion. He had gathered proof. The third binder contained engineering calculations, load capacities, safety margins, stress analyses, entire pages filled with neat equations explaining exactly how each substitution reduced structural reliability. Thomas hadn't merely believed corners had been cut. He had proven it. Caleb rubbed both hands across his face. His father had carried this knowledge alone for years. Why? The answer waited inside another letter tucked between the pages. "I know what you're thinking." "Why didn't I stop him?" Caleb read silently. "Because every time I looked at the evidence, I also saw my son. Grant made terrible choices. He is still my son." That truth became heavier than any beam I ever lifted. Caleb closed his eyes. He understood. Combat had taught him that impossible decisions existed. Sometimes every option left someone wounded. Thomas had lived inside one of those decisions for years. Another paragraph caught his attention. "I tried to confront Grant privately, 3 times. Each conversation ended the same way. Nobody gets hurt. The buildings still stand. Everyone does this." Eventually, he stopped arguing. That frightened me more than the invoices. Caleb remembered Grant's confidence, his certainty, his calm smile. Had it started here, years before anyone noticed? He continued reading. "I considered taking everything to state investigators. I even drove to Helena once intending to do exactly that. I turned around halfway there. Cowardice wears many respectable faces. Caleb's throat tightened. He had never imagined his father describing himself that way. Thomas Mercer had been the bravest man Caleb had ever known. The final pages changed completely. No engineering, no invoices, only personal words. If you have found these records, then I am gone. If I am gone, I can no longer choose between protecting my son and protecting innocent families. That choice becomes yours. Caleb stared at the sentence. His heartbeat echoed inside the quiet workshop. Titan slowly stood. The old German shepherd crossed the room and rested his head against Caleb's shoulder. The familiar grounding pressure steadied him. Caleb smiled sadly. He always knew what to say. Titan closed his eyes. The final page waited. You have worn this country's uniform. You already know that loyalty matters. But remember something military service taught both of us. Loyalty to people never excuses betrayal of principle. If you choose truth, do not do it because I failed. Do it because innocent people deserve someone who finishes what fear prevented me from beginning. Forgive your brother if you can. Protect others whether you can forgive him or not. Those are not the same thing. The signature at the bottom was simple. Dad. Caleb folded the letter carefully. He sat in complete silence. The rain above seemed farther away now. The workshop no longer felt like a hidden room. It felt like a burden passed from one generation to the next. Titan nudged Caleb's hand gently. The movement broke the silence. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the old dog's ears. You didn't just find a room. Titan's tail tapped the floor once. You found Dad's last mission. The old German shepherd looked toward the binders, then back at Caleb. The meaning needed no words. Caleb carefully stacked every binder back inside the cabinet. He placed the letter inside his jacket. Not hidden, close to his heart. When he finally climbed the concealed staircase back into the house, dawn had begun breaking over the Beartooth Mountains. Golden light poured through the eastern windows, filling the empty rooms Thomas had built with quiet purpose. Caleb stood in the center of the house. He no longer saw an abandoned mountain property. He saw a promise, one his father had been unable to keep, one his faithful dog had refused to let disappear. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, a far greater one had just begun. Morning sunlight spread across the wide plank floor, turning the dust floating through the air into ribbons of gold. The mountain house felt unchanged. The stone fireplace still stood silent. The timber beams still carried the same quiet strength Thomas Mercer had built into them years before. Only Caleb had changed. He stood in the center of the room, holding his father's letter, unable to decide whether the weight pressing against his chest came from the folded pages or the decision they demanded. Titan sat nearby. The old German shepherd watched Caleb with the calm patience that had guided him through firefights, helicopter landings, sleepless nights, and the long road home. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Finally, Caleb folded the letter and slipped it carefully inside the inner pocket of his jacket. I wish you had left me a simpler inheritance. Titan's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Caleb looked toward the mountains outside the window. I know why you couldn't do it yourself. His father had loved Grant. That truth lived beside every page of evidence hidden beneath the staircase. Thomas had not protected corruption. He had protected the hope that his oldest son might someday choose a different path. That hope had died with him. Or perhaps it had simply become Caleb's burden. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence. Titan was on his feet instantly. He moved to the front window without barking. Helen Brooks stepped out of her pickup carrying 2 paper sacks and a metal thermos. When Caleb opened the door, she studied his face for only a second. "You found it." It was not a question. Caleb nodded once. Helen slowly exhaled. "I wondered how long it would take. You knew there was a workshop. I knew there was something." She stepped inside. "Thomas never showed me, but I knew he wasn't driving up here every Saturday just to drink coffee with an old widow." She placed the sacks on the kitchen counter. "I baked too much bread again." Caleb smiled faintly. "I think you planned that. I absolutely planned that." For a few moments they worked quietly, slicing bread and heating soup over the old stove. The ordinary routine settled Caleb's thoughts. Sometimes the simplest work made the hardest conversations possible. Finally, Helen looked at him. "What did he leave you?" Caleb hesitated, then removed the folded letter. He documented everything. Helen read only the first page before gently folding it again. "So he finally told you. He knew Grant was replacing materials." Helen closed her eyes. "I was afraid of that." "You knew, I knew he carried something heavy." She looked toward the workshop door hidden beneath the staircase. "I didn't know what." Caleb sat across from her. He had proof enough? More than enough. Silence settled over the kitchen. Outside, wind stirred through the pine trees. Helen wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I've spent 40 years watching families in these mountains." She spoke softly. "They survive storms. They survive drought. They survive losing everything. But secrets." She looked directly at Caleb. "Secrets break people in ways winter never can." Caleb stared into his untouched soup. "If I hand these records over, you'll lose your brothers." "I may already have." Helen nodded slowly. "Maybe." She reached across the table. "But tell me something. If you stay silent." She paused. "Can you still look at yourself in the mirror?" The question lingered long after she left. That evening, Caleb carried one of the engineering binders onto the porch. He read until sunset painted the mountain peaks deep orange. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. Every photograph confirmed the same pattern. Thomas had never exaggerated. He had documented facts. Titan rested beside him. As darkness settled across the valley, headlights appeared far below on the county road. For an instant, Caleb's heartbeat accelerated. Combat memories surged without warning. Vehicle approaching. Unknown intent. Possible threat. His breathing shortened. The muscles in his shoulders tightened automatically. Titan reacted before the panic fully arrived. The old German shepherd leaned firmly against Caleb's leg. Not enough to knock him off balance. Just enough to interrupt the spiral. Caleb closed his eyes. He focused on the familiar weight. The warmth of Titan's shoulder. The steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. The mountains returned. The porch returned. The headlights belonged to an ordinary ranch truck continuing down the valley. Nothing more. "I'm here," Caleb whispered. Titan remained beside him until his breathing slowed again. The attack passed. Not completely. They never disappeared completely. But this one no longer controlled him. The next morning, Caleb drove into Red Lodge for supplies. The town moved through its ordinary routines. Children waited outside the elementary school. Ranch trucks lined the hardware store parking lot. Neighbors greeted one another by first name. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet Caleb found himself studying buildings differently now. Every foundation, every retaining wall, every concrete step. How many had been built honestly? How many carried invisible compromises? At Marsh Hardware, he bought nails, roofing screws, and lumber for repairs around the mountain house. The owner, Owen Marsh, recognized him immediately. Thomas's boy. Caleb smiled politely. I guess that's still how folks know me. It'll always be. Owen carried the lumber toward the truck himself. Your father once refused a contract worth $500,000. Caleb looked surprised. Why? The customer wanted cheaper materials. Owen shrugged. Thomas told him he wasn't in the business of building future problems. The word settled heavily inside Caleb. Future problems. His father had spent years documenting exactly that. On the drive home, Caleb passed Mercer Construction. The new company sign gleamed above the office entrance. Several expensive pickups sat in the parking lot. Grant had rebuilt the business image quickly. Caleb almost kept driving. Instead, he turned into the parking lot. Titan remained inside the truck. The old dog watched through the windshield. Grant looked up from behind his office desk as Caleb entered. A brief smile crossed his face. I was wondering when you'd show up. Caleb closed the office door behind him. Neither brother offered a handshake. The room felt strangely unfamiliar. Thomas's old drafting table was gone. Family photographs had disappeared. Modern furniture filled the office instead. Grant leaned back comfortably. What can I do for you? Caleb reached into his jacket. For one dangerous second, Grant's eyes flickered toward Caleb's pocket. He knew. Not what Caleb carried, but that something had changed. Caleb removed only his father's letter. Not the binders. Not the evidence, just the letter. Dad knew. Grant's expression remained carefully controlled. Knew what? The materials. Silence. The substitutions. Another silence. Finally, Grant sighed. You don't understand construction. I understand honesty. Grant stood slowly. You understand war. You understand business. We're different people. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Did you replace the concrete? Grant walked toward the window. Nothing failed. That's not what I asked. Grant didn't answer. Instead, he spoke while looking outside. Do you know how many companies bid on public projects? No. Dozens. You either stay competitive, he turned, or you close your doors. Dad never believed that. Dad lived in another era. Caleb felt disappointment replacing anger. Grant truly believed what he was saying. He had convinced himself compromise was simply part of success. Caleb asked one final question. If children were inside one of those buildings, Grant interrupted. They're safe. You don't know that. I know enough. Caleb studied his brother for a long moment, then quietly placed the folded letter back into his pocket. I hoped you'd tell me I was wrong. Grant looked away. Caleb understood. The answer had already been given. When he returned to the truck, Titan immediately rested his head against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb started the engine without speaking. The mountain road seemed longer than ever. Family, duty, honor. They had once pointed in the same direction. Now each demanded something different. As the mountain house came into view beneath the late afternoon sun, Caleb realized the decision waiting for him could no longer be postponed. His father had entrusted him with the truth. His brother had chosen not to deny it. And somewhere beyond the valley, people were living, working, and raising families inside buildings that might depend on what Caleb decided next. He looked at Titan. The old German shepherd met his gaze without hesitation. Caleb nodded slowly. I know what I have to do. The hardest part was knowing exactly what it would cost. Caleb sat behind the wheel long after the truck had stopped in front of the mountain house. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Titan remained beside him, watching the valley through the windshield. The old German shepherd had learned long ago that some battles could not be rushed. Sometimes the strongest thing a soldier could do was sit quietly, until his partner was ready. The mountains stood beneath a clear winter sky. Nothing about them suggested that lives were hanging in the balance. Yet somewhere beyond those ridges stood buildings raised with hidden compromises. Caleb reached inside his jacket and touched his father's letter. "I'll finish it," he whispered. The next morning began with an unexpected voice on the radio. County officials have temporarily restricted access to portions of the newly opened Bitter Creek Veterans Rehabilitation Center after maintenance crews discovered several unusual structural cracks. Caleb froze. The coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. The announcer continued. Administrators describe the measure as precautionary, while engineers conduct further inspections. Therapy appointments have been relocated where possible. Officials emphasize there is no immediate cause for panic. Titan immediately lifted his head. Caleb turned the volume higher. The report lasted less than a minute, but it was enough. He knew exactly which project the reporter meant. His father's notes mentioned it repeatedly. One of Grant's largest contracts. One of the projects where Thomas had documented material substitutions with extraordinary detail. Caleb hurried downstairs into the hidden workshop. He opened the cabinet. The binder labeled Veterans Rehabilitation Center lay exactly where he remembered. Inside were photographs of foundation work, delivery tickets, engineering specifications, and Thomas's handwritten comparisons. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion: specified concrete strength, actual delivery, specified reinforcing steel, actual installation, independent testing requirements, signatures approving work that Thomas believed never met specification. Caleb closed the binder. His heartbeat echoed through the workshop. People were already inside that building. Not strangers. Veterans. Men and women carrying injuries much like his own. Some invisible, some permanent. He looked toward Titan. "We're out of time." Within an hour they were driving toward town. Snowbanks lined both sides of the highway. The rehabilitation center stood just outside Red Lodge on gently rising ground overlooking open ranch land. At first glance it appeared beautiful. Modern stone entrance, wide windows, American flag lifting proudly in the winter wind. Families arrived carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Several veterans walked slowly across the parking lot, using canes or prosthetic legs. Nothing looked wrong. Then Caleb saw it. A diagonal crack stretched from the corner of one large window toward the foundation. Another crossed the brickwork beneath the entrance canopy. Not hairline fractures. Real movement. He remembered his father's voice. Vertical cracks often mean settling. Diagonal cracks mean something underneath is moving. Caleb slowly crossed the parking lot. Titan remained close beside him. Several people smiled as they passed, admiring the old military dog. None of them noticed what Caleb saw. He knelt near the foundation. The crack widened slightly near ground level. Fresh mortar dust lay beneath it. Someone had recently attempted cosmetic repairs. His stomach tightened. He took several photographs, not because he doubted his father's records, because he wanted today's truth beside yesterday's evidence. As he stood, a familiar black SUV turned into the parking lot. Grant. Their eyes met across the entrance. Grant walked quickly toward him. "What are you doing here?" Caleb held up his phone. "Looking." Grant lowered his voice. "This isn't the place. I disagree." Several visitors glanced toward the brothers before continuing inside. Grant forced a smile until they passed. Then his expression hardened. "Come with me." They stepped away from the entrance toward the edge of the parking lot. Titan positioned himself quietly beside Caleb. Grant noticed. "He still doesn't trust me." Caleb answered calmly. "He trusts actions." Grant ignored the remark. What exactly do you think you're proving? I'm trying to understand why the walls are cracking. Buildings settle. Not like this. Grant looked away toward the rehabilitation center. You don't know enough about engineering to judge. My father did. Silence. Grant's jaw tightened. I told you already. Dad wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Caleb reached into his jacket. For a brief second, Grant looked alarmed. Instead of removing the binders, Caleb produced one photograph. Only one. It showed reinforcing steel before concrete had been poured. Beside it, Thomas had written measurements. Grant stared at it. Only for an instant. Then he looked away. Old photographs don't prove anything. They prove Dad was watching. Grant folded his arms. You need to let this go. I can't. You can. No. Grant stepped closer. You have no idea how many people depend on this company. Caleb answered quietly. I know exactly how many depend on that building. Neither brother spoke again. The winter wind moved between them. Finally, Grant turned back toward his SUV. Don't make a mistake you can't take back. He drove away without waiting for an answer. Caleb remained standing beside Titan. The old dog continued watching the rehabilitation center. A movement caught Caleb's attention. Two men wearing dark jackets stood across the street beside a pickup truck. Neither entered the building. Neither seemed interested in the scenery. One raised binoculars briefly toward the parking lot, then lowered them. Caleb recognized the behavior immediately. Observation, not sightseeing. Military instincts returned. He gently rested one hand on Titan's neck. Easy. Titan remained silent. One of the men climbed into the pickup. The truck slowly pulled onto the road behind Caleb's vehicle. Coincidence? Maybe. Caleb drove away. The pickup followed. 3 intersections later, still behind them, Caleb turned onto a narrower county road. The pickup stayed with him. He glanced at Titan. The German shepherd had already noticed. His ears stood forward. Every muscle remained alert. Caleb smiled faintly. Thought so. Instead of continuing toward the mountain house, Caleb turned onto an older logging road winding through dense pine forest. The pickup followed another quarter mile, then stopped. It waited, watching, before finally turning around and disappearing back toward town. Caleb remained parked until it was gone. His pulse remained steady. Years earlier, such surveillance would have preceded something much worse. Today, it simply confirmed one thing. Someone knew he had the records. When he reached home after dark, Helen's truck already waited outside. She stepped onto the porch the moment she saw him. I heard the radio. So did I. She studied his face. You've seen it yourself? He nodded. The cracks are real. Helen looked toward the mountains. What happens now? Caleb carried the binder inside and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. Now. He rested one hand on his father's letter. I stop waiting. That night he copied every page from the rehabilitation center binder using the old scanner Thomas had hidden in the workshop. He stored duplicate files on several flash drives. He sealed paper copies inside waterproof envelopes. Military planning. Always prepare for losing the original. Titan lay quietly beside the workbench throughout the long night. Just before dawn, Caleb finished organizing the final stack of evidence. He looked down at the old German shepherd. You've kept me alive more than once. Titan slowly stood. This time, Caleb rested both hands against the dog's shoulders. We're going to try keeping everyone else alive, too. Outside, first light spread across the snow-covered Beartooth Mountains. Neither Caleb nor Titan noticed the distant pair of headlights parked silently at the far end of the mountain road. Someone else had begun watching the house, and they were no longer hiding it. The pickup remained at the far end of the mountain road, just long enough for Caleb to notice its silhouette through the kitchen window. Then it disappeared behind the pines. Titan did not move from the porch. His ears remained forward, his body perfectly still, watching the place where the headlights had vanished. Caleb understood the posture. The danger had not arrived. It had simply announced itself. He quietly locked every door, closed the curtains, and carried the original binders back into the hidden workshop beneath the staircase. One by one, he placed the evidence inside waterproof storage cases. The copies stayed upstairs. The originals disappeared once again behind the concealed wall. Military habit. Never leave everything in one place. By sunrise, he had barely slept. Helen arrived shortly after 8, carrying fresh coffee and homemade biscuits. She noticed the fatigue in Caleb's face immediately. "You weren't alone last night." He looked toward the road. "No." She followed his gaze. "They came? I think they wanted me to know they could." Helen set the coffee on the table. "You still planning to go?" Caleb nodded. "I leave today." "You'll need witnesses." "I know. You'll need copies." "I have them." She hesitated. "And if someone tries to stop you?" Caleb glanced toward Titan. "I'm not alone." Helen smiled sadly. "No." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You never have been." An hour later, Caleb drove toward Helena. Snow drifted across the highway in thin ribbons. Titan rested quietly in the passenger seat, one paw touching Caleb's leg, as though refusing to let the distance between them grow even an inch. Neither noticed the dark SUV that merged onto the highway several miles behind them. It remained there, always 3 or 4 vehicles back, never closer, never farther. Caleb noticed it outside Livingston. The same vehicle remained behind them through Big Timber. By the time they reached the interstate, he no longer believed in coincidence. He exited unexpectedly at a small truck stop. The SUV continued straight. Then, 200 yards later, its brake lights flashed. It exited too. Caleb pulled beside the fuel pumps. The SUV parked across the lot. No one got out. Titan quietly growled, not loudly, just enough for Caleb to hear. "They're waiting." Caleb finished fueling. Instead of returning immediately to the highway, he drove around the back of the truck stop and exited onto a county road running parallel to the interstate. The SUV hesitated, then followed. Confirmation. Caleb's pulse remained calm. Years of training settled over him like an old uniform. Observe. Don't panic. Think. Several miles later, he turned toward the county sheriff's substation. The SUV slowed, stopped, then turned around before reaching the parking lot. Caleb watched it disappear. No confrontation, no chase, only intimidation. He understood the message. Someone desperately wanted those documents. By early afternoon, Caleb reached the Montana Department of Public Safety building. The receptionist directed him upstairs to the Structural Investigations Division. An engineer named Sarah Whitmore met him in a modest conference room. She appeared to be in her early 50s, practical, composed, and carrying the quiet confidence of someone who trusted evidence more than opinions. "What can I help you with?" Caleb placed the first binder on the table. "My father collected these." Sarah opened the cover. She expected complaints. Instead, she found photographs, engineering notes, invoices, material certifications. Her expression changed within minutes. She stopped speaking altogether. Page after page, she examined Thomas Mercer's documentation with growing concentration. Occasionally, she reached for a calculator. Other times, she compared handwritten measurements against structural drawings. Nearly 30 minutes passed before she finally looked up. Who prepared these? My father. What was his profession? Military engineer before construction. Sarah nodded slowly. It shows. She turned another page. The documentation is remarkably thorough. She reached the rehabilitation center section. The room grew noticeably quieter. Sarah carefully examined every photograph of reinforcing steel, every invoice, every engineering note. Finally, she removed her glasses. Mr. Mercer. Her voice carried a seriousness Caleb had hoped never to hear. If these records accurately represent what was built, she paused. This rehabilitation center may not satisfy the structural safety margins specified in the approved design. Caleb remained silent. He already knew. Sarah looked directly at him. Have you shared these with anyone else? I've made copies. Good. She immediately picked up the telephone. Within minutes, another engineer entered. Then another. Soon, 3 specialists surrounded the conference table, reviewing Thomas's records independently. They asked technical questions. Caleb answered only what he knew. When he didn't know, he simply said so. Facts. Nothing more. Late that afternoon, Sarah returned carrying several official folders. We're requesting an emergency inspection. Today? Immediately. She hesitated. There are veterans receiving treatment inside that building. I know. Her eyes softened. My husband served in Iraq. She glanced toward Titan. I understand why you came. Caleb stood. So what happens now? We verify everything. And if the records are correct, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As Caleb stepped outside, his phone rang. Grant. He stared at the screen, then answered. You actually did it. Grant's voice was tight with controlled anger. I turned over the evidence. You destroyed everything. No. Caleb looked toward the mountains beyond the city. I gave people the chance to prevent something worse. You think you're the hero? I never wanted to be. You could have come to me. I did. Silence. Grant finally spoke again. You don't understand what's coming. I understand enough. You've ended this family. Caleb closed his eyes. No, Grant. His voice remained steady. You ended it the day you decided someone's life was worth less than your profit margin. The line went silent, then disconnected. Caleb slipped the phone back into his pocket. Titan gently leaned against his leg. The old dog sensed everything without hearing a single word. They began the drive home beneath a gray Montana sky. Halfway back, Sarah called. They've cleared the rehabilitation center. Caleb gripped the steering wheel. So quickly? The preliminary inspection found significant structural concerns. She paused. The facility is being evacuated until a complete engineering assessment is finished. Caleb slowly released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you. No. Sarah answered quietly. Thank your father. Snow began falling as they entered the Beartooth foothills. By the time Caleb reached the mountain house, several inches had already covered the gravel road. Helen was waiting on the porch. She looked at his face, then smiled before he spoke. They listened. They're evacuating the building. Helen closed her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she whispered. Thomas would finally be able to sleep. That night, the local news interrupted regular programming. Footage showed emergency vehicles outside the rehabilitation center. Patients were being transported safely to temporary facilities. State investigators carried boxes of documents from Mercer Construction's offices. The reporter spoke carefully. Officials emphasize these actions are precautionary, while engineers conduct a comprehensive structural assessment. Caleb turned off the television. He didn't need the headlines. He already understood what they meant. Justice had begun, peace was still much farther away. Outside, Titan suddenly lifted his head. A low growl escaped his throat. Not toward the road, toward the darkness beyond the barn. Caleb quietly reached for the flashlight beside the door. The snow outside reflected pale moonlight. Fresh footprints crossed the yard. They led directly toward the hidden workshop beneath the house. Someone had already come looking for the evidence, and they were willing to return. Caleb swept the flashlight slowly across the fresh snow. The footprints began near the gravel road, crossed the yard without hesitation, and stopped beneath the kitchen window before circling toward the hidden workshop below the staircase. Whoever had come knew exactly where to search. Titan lowered his nose to the tracks. His ears stood forward. He followed the scent to the side of the house, paused beneath the basement windows, then returned to Caleb without barking. The old German shepherd looked up at him, waiting. They didn't get in. Caleb checked every door, every window. Every concealed latch Thomas had built into the workshop remained untouched. The hidden room had survived another night. But the message was unmistakable. The evidence had become valuable enough for someone to risk coming onto the property. Helen walked over from her farmhouse carrying a lantern. She studied the tracks without speaking. They came after dark. Caleb nodded. They knew where to look. They'll realize they're too late. I hope so. Helen looked toward the mountains. People who spend their lives hiding the truth rarely stop after the first failure. Caleb quietly brushed fresh snow over the tracks leading to the workshop entrance. Not to erase what had happened, to force anyone returning to leave new evidence behind, old habits from another life. The following days unfolded with remarkable speed. State investigators remained inside Mercer Construction from sunrise until evening. Local newspapers filled their front pages with photographs of the evacuated rehabilitation center. Structural engineers drilled concrete cores. Steel samples disappeared into testing laboratories. Television crews gathered outside the courthouse. Grant's name appeared everywhere. Caleb avoided every interview. Whenever reporters knocked at the mountain house, Helen politely turned them away. He didn't do this for attention, she told them. He did it because someone had to. The world beyond the mountains grew louder. The house remained quiet. Caleb spent his mornings repairing loose porch boards. His afternoons were filled with small jobs for nearby ranchers. Each evening ended in the workshop beneath the staircase where he continued reading Thomas's journals one page at a time. Titan never wandered far. Sometimes he slept beside the fireplace, sometimes beside Caleb's workbench. Yet every night, just before bed, the old dog returned to the hidden room as though making one final inspection. 3 weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes. Water rushed through narrow streams beneath the pines. One afternoon, Caleb was replacing fence rails near the garden when Titan suddenly lifted his head. Not alarmed, curious. The German shepherd trotted toward the workshop stairs, then disappeared below. Caleb smiled faintly. Checking your post again? No bark answered. Only silence. A different silence. One that made Caleb set down his hammer. He followed Titan downstairs. The workshop remained exactly as he had left it. The binders sat safely inside the cabinet. The journals rested neatly on the shelf. Titan stood near Thomas's original workbench, his nose pressed against the old pine floor beneath it. He scratched once, stopped, then looked back at Caleb. You've already found everything. Titan scratched again, slower this time. Caleb knelt. The floorboards appeared ordinary. Years of wear, old nail heads, nothing unusual. Still, he trusted the dog more than appearances. He fetched one of Thomas's pry bars. Carefully, he lifted the narrow plank. A puff of dry dust rose into the workshop light. Beneath the board rested a small steel box, no larger than an old ammunition case. Its surface carried no lock, only a single brass plate. For Caleb. His heartbeat quickened. Titan sat quietly beside him, almost satisfied. Caleb lifted the lid. Inside lay another sealed envelope. Beneath it rested a folded property deed, several bank documents, and a leather-bound notebook much newer than the others. He opened the letter first. Caleb, if you have found this, then Titan has once again proven that he listens better than most people. Despite everything, Caleb laughed softly. It sounded exactly like something his father would write. He continued reading. The papers beneath this letter matter, but not as much as the reason I saved them. Caleb unfolded the deed. The property belonged entirely to him. No liens, no debts, no conditions. The second envelope contained financial records, a trust account, established years earlier. Beneficiary Caleb Mercer. Balance. Enough to restore the property, enough to begin again. His father had quietly prepared for the future, one careful deposit at a time. Helen arrived later that afternoon carrying fresh soup. She found Caleb sitting on the workshop floor with the letter resting across his knees. What happened? He left something else. She sat beside him. What is it? Caleb handed her the final pages. Helen read silently. Tears filled her eyes before she reached the end. He planned all of this. Caleb nodded. The last section of the letter contained architectural drawings unlike any Thomas had prepared before. Cabins, walking trails, a woodworking shop, gardens, dog kennels, therapy rooms overlooking the mountains. Every building carefully arranged around the original house. Across the top of the plans, Thomas had written one title, Mercer Ridge Veterans Retreat. Beneath it, another note. A soldier who comes home carrying invisible wounds deserves more than sympathy. He deserves purpose. He deserves peace. He deserves a place where loyal dogs can keep saving lives after the battlefield grows quiet. Caleb stared at the drawings. His father hadn't imagined a business. He had imagined healing, not only for Caleb, for countless others. Another page explained the trust. Thomas had quietly sold several private woodworking commissions over the years. Every dollar went into the account. Not for himself. For this. For Caleb. For the retreat. I thought the house was my inheritance, Caleb whispered. Helen gently folded the letter. No. She smiled through tears. The house was only the doorway. That evening, Caleb walked slowly across the property with Titan beside him. The late winter sun settled behind the Beartooth Mountains. He unfolded the architectural plans once more. Here, a cabin for veterans. There, a woodworking barn. Near the creek, a fenced meadow where retired military working dogs could spend their final years running free. He could almost see it. Not abandoned. Alive, filled with voices, laughter, hope. Titan wandered toward the old fence line, then stopped. He looked back at Caleb. The scar above the dog's shoulder caught the evening light. The years had whitened his muzzle. His movements had slowed, but his eyes remained exactly the same. Steady, faithful, certain. Caleb knelt beside him. You didn't just save me. Titan rested his forehead gently against Caleb's. You saved everyone who'll come after me." The wind carried softly through the pine trees. For the first time since returning to Montana, Caleb felt something stronger than relief. Purpose. The inheritance Thomas had protected was never hidden evidence, never the land, never the money. It was a future waiting for one broken soldier to believe he deserved to build it. And thanks to one stubborn old war dog, that future had finally been found. Spring arrived slowly in the Beartooth Mountains. Snow retreated from the valleys first, revealing patches of green that spread across the hillsides one day at a time. Meltwater rushed through the creek below the property, carrying away the silence of winter. Birds returned to the pines, and the mountain house no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. The old sign at the entrance had been sanded smooth and mounted on 2 cedar posts Caleb had cut himself. The carved letters were simple: Mercer Ridge Veterans Retreat. Below them, in smaller lettering, were the words Thomas had written years before. Build good ones. Caleb ran his hand across the sign before stepping back. Titan stood beside him, his gray muzzle lifted toward the morning breeze. The scar along his shoulder had healed, though the fur would never grow back the same. He moved a little slower now, favoring one leg after long walks, but his eyes still carried the quiet confidence that had guided Caleb through every difficult step. You earned the first look, Caleb said. Titan wagged his tail once. It was enough. The old mountain house had changed without losing its soul. Thomas's timber beams remained untouched. The stone fireplace still anchored the great room. The workshop beneath the staircase had become the heart, the retreat, its walls lined with carefully restored hand tools bearing the initials of Caleb's grandfather. Nothing valuable had been replaced. Everything meaningful had been preserved. The first cabin stood 100 yards from the main house, overlooking the valley. Then came a second. Neighbors volunteered weekends. Local ranchers donated lumber. The carpenter who had once worked beside Thomas returned to teach younger volunteers traditional joinery. Even Owen Marsh arrived one Saturday morning, carrying a truckload of reclaimed white oak. Your father would have hated seeing good lumber wasted, he said with a grin. Caleb smiled. He taught me the same thing. Helen Brooks became the unofficial grandmother of the retreat. She planted tomatoes beside the south fence. She insisted every veteran leave with homemade bread. She learned everyone's name. And every evening she sat on the porch watching the sunset exactly as she once had with Thomas. Sometimes she spoke. Most evenings she simply enjoyed the quiet company. Luke Mercer arrived the first weekend in June. He parked at the gate and remained inside his truck for several minutes before finally walking toward the porch. He looked older. Not because of time, because of regret. Caleb met him halfway down the path. Neither brother knew what to say. Finally, Luke spoke. I should have stood beside you. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. You weren't ready. Luke nodded. I know. He looked toward the cabins rising beyond the trees. I'd like to help. Caleb handed him a work apron hanging from the porch railing. Can you carry lumber? Luke laughed softly. I think I can manage that. They never discussed the past that day. They simply worked. Sometimes healing began with conversation. Sometimes it began with lifting the same beam together. Week after week, Luke returned. He learned to cut joints instead of shortcuts. He measured twice. He listened more than he talked. Slowly, trust returned, not because it was demanded, but because it was earned. One afternoon, a county truck pulled into the driveway. Sarah Whitmore stepped out carrying a folder. The investigation is complete, she said. Caleb invited her inside. She looked around the workshop, beneath the staircase, with open admiration. So this is where your father planned everything. He never stopped building. Sarah nodded. The rehabilitation center will be rebuilt from the foundation up. She paused, using the original specifications. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Good. She handed him the folder. The criminal cases are finished. Grant had accepted responsibility for the fraud charges connected to the material substitutions. Several corrupt inspectors faced their own legal consequences. The official report credited Thomas Mercer's documentation with preventing future structural failures. Sarah smiled gently. Your father saved lives. Caleb looked toward the workshop wall where Thomas's old tape measure now hung. He just needed someone to finish the mission. Later that evening, Caleb stood alone outside. The mountains glowed beneath the last light of sunset. Titan wandered toward the garden where Helen was gathering vegetables. A pickup truck rolled slowly through the gate. An older man stepped out, followed by a black Labrador wearing a faded service harness. The veteran hesitated. He looked embarrassed. I'm sorry to bother you. You're not bothering anyone, Caleb replied. The man looked exhausted. I heard this place helps veterans. We try. The man rested one hand on his dog's back. I've been sleeping in my truck. He looked down. I wasn't sure where else to go. Caleb recognized the expression immediately. He had seen it every morning in his own reflection months earlier. The mixture of pride, exhaustion, and quiet desperation. He smiled. I know exactly how that feels. The veteran looked surprised. You do? Caleb glanced toward the mountain house. More than you know. Titan approached slowly. The old German shepherd stopped in front of the Labrador. The two dogs sniffed noses gently before standing quietly beside one another. No barking, no tension, only recognition. War dogs understood each other without words. Caleb opened the front door. Come inside. The veteran hesitated only a moment before following. Warm light spilled across the porch. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Laughter echoed softly from the dining room where volunteers were setting the table. It sounded like home. As darkness settled over the mountains, Caleb walked into the workshop one final time. He carried Thomas's worn Stanley tape measure. The yellow case was faded. One corner remained wrapped with old black electrical tape exactly as his father had repaired it years before. Caleb drove a single brass hook into the beam above the workshop entrance. Then he carefully hung the tape measure where everyone entering would see it. Not as decoration, as a reminder. Helen appeared quietly behind him. He'd be proud. Caleb smiled. I hope so. She looked around the workshop, at Elias's tools, at Thomas's journals, at the new workbench where young volunteers were already learning. Then she looked toward the open doorway where Titan rested beside the newest veteran's dog. You know, she said softly, most people think an inheritance is something you keep. Caleb watched sunlight fade through the basement windows. My father taught me something different. Helen waited. It's something you pass on. Outside, the evening breeze moved gently through the pines. The retreat settled into peaceful silence. Veterans shared stories around the stone fireplace Thomas had built. Retired military dogs slept beside the people who understood them best. The mountain house that everyone had mocked, because it cost only $400, had become something no amount of money could ever purchase. A place where broken lives could begin again. Caleb rested one hand on Titan's shoulder. The old German shepherd leaned gently against him, just as he had through nightmares, panic attacks, grief, and impossible decisions. Neither of them had reached the mountain looking for a future. They had only been trying to survive. Together, they had found something far greater. They had found a home, and in giving that home to others, a wounded Navy SEAL, his faithful K-9, and one father's quiet legacy proved that the greatest inheritance is never measured in dollars, land, or hidden secrets. It is measured in the lives restored because someone chose honor over comfort, truth over silence, and hope over despair. In the mountains above Red Lodge, where one forgotten house had once stood empty, that promise would continue for generations. Exactly as Thomas Mercer had always intended. If you believe doing the right thing is worth the cost, type honor in the comments, or simply comment 1 if you would have made the same choice Caleb did. Stories like this remind us that a person's greatest legacy isn't what they leave behind. It's the lives they help lift up. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about justice, courage, loyal dogs, and second chances in the land of the free, we'd be honored to have you subscribe and join us for the next journey.